Okay, let's kick it off. Hi, I'm Nicole Torres. I'm an editor at Bloomberg Opinion based in London, and we are going to be talking about the latest with what's happening in the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. So I'm joined by two people on the screen who will do most of the talking. Marc Champion is a Bloomberg Opinion columnist covering the Middle East, based here in London with me, and Ruth Pollard is Bloomberg Opinion's managing editor in Asia, based in Tokyo, who's staying up very late to talk to us. Both of them have been closely following what's happening in Gaza, and they've been producing excellent commentary for us. So we're going to talk about their most recent columns, and just in general, I want to get a sense of what you both are hearing from the region and what you're thinking about. But first, maybe we can start with what's going on today. So let's talk about the news that we're seeing this morning about a possible limited truce deal between Hamas and Israel that might be announced as soon as today. I don't know if we have any details or if you two can fill us in on what to expect.
If I just have a go. I mean, it's we're basically reliant on reporting plus what Ismail Haniyeh said today, one of the Hamas heads. And he basically confirmed that they're close. The US has said that they're close. It looks like we're waiting for the Israelis to kind of sign off. But in terms of details, we're kind of reliant on reporting. Looks like a truce that would be for 3 to 5 days. 50 hostages would be released by Hamas. A number of prisoners would be released by Israel, Palestinian prisoners. And then during this pause, some 300 trucks of humanitarian aid would be allowed in. So there's a kind of a number of moving parts, but we really don't know the details, and we don't even really know which details are kind of holding it up. The Qataris, who are the moderators, say they're technical, but that could cover a wealth of sins.
Okay. Do we know who is putting this deal forward?
Well, the moderators are the Qataris, so they're in a very interesting position in the sense that they host a number of Hamas leaders in Qatar. They're trusted. They have been funders of Hamas. They also host the most important U.S. military base in the Middle East. So they are in a kind of really unique position to do this, and they are the ones who've been pushed. It's been going on for weeks, almost since the beginning of the conflict.
Okay. And has there been any confirmation from Israel, or is that sort of what we're waiting on now?
It's what we're waiting on, basically.
Okay. And that kind of ties nicely into your latest column for us, Marc, in which you say that Israel is at risk of winning the battle in Gaza, but losing the war. You write that embracing this kind of deal would be good for Netanyahu and sort of give Israel the chance to turn the tables on Hamas. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the essential point I was trying to make is that, we know from so many previous conflicts, where you have a completely dominant military force. The US in Iraq, the US in Afghanistan are two, obvious examples. And in both cases, there was no question as to what the initial outcome would be. The US won quickly in both cases. The IDF seems to be moving pretty fast in Gaza. In military terms, this is a big piece of urban warfare, which is the hardest thing you can do in war, more or less. So they are moving quite quickly, in military terms. But the point I was trying to make is that, from day one, it seemed to me, at least, that the calculation the Israelis have to make is how do we, once we've dealt with Hamas, what do we do? What is our plan? And that plan has been unclear from the start. It's even changed, initially saying the one thing we know we don't want to do is occupy. And now, more recently, Benjamin Netanyahu said we'll stay, keep the security force there indefinitely until we're, sure that there's no more Hamas threat. But what we know about, terrorist organizations, such as Hamas, which are both governing and terrorist, that they can be incredibly sticky, and that the more killing goes on, the harder it is to kind of remove them as a movement, as this set of Hamas fighters might get killed, and then a new set arise. You can even have a new group, like in Iraq. ISIS was formed. So these are the things that really I think the Israelis have, surely aware of, but are under emphasizing in their calculus, and simply focused, this is our opportunity to destroy Hamas. We're going to do it. And my question to them really is, okay, so how do you destroy an organization that's not just a military but an ideology, and is has kind of deep roots in the society, etc. So how are you going to do that? So far, I think they have not really given much. None of their actions have given a lot of hope for a plan after. And all I'm saying about the truce is use it. Don't waste it. Use it.
Yeah. Thank you. And Ruth, you also mentioned in your latest piece too that it would not be enough to agree to a ceasefire of this kind in Gaza because violence is spreading elsewhere, particularly in the West Bank. Can you just talk a bit about what you had been hearing and seeing reporting from there?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that this conflict didn't start on October 7 when Hamas rushed across the border and slaughtered Israelis and other foreign nationals. It didn't start then. Palestinians feel that it started in 1948 with the formation of the State of Israel, which they describe as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And of course, now Israel's been militarily occupying these Palestinian territories since the 1967 war. So we're talking about decades and decades and decades of enmity, of violence, and of resistance that informs what it is to be a Palestinian person living in those territories. And so you'll see President Joe Biden, for example, say, we have to push towards an independent Palestinian state. It's not enough that Israel gets rid of Hamas. Unless you can give Palestinians a state that they can live in securely and at peace, then getting rid of Hamas is just, another Iraq, as Marc said, where you get rid of one militant group and then another one will pop up, because essentially people are resisting their occupiers. And I think it's really important for us to remember that.
Yeah. No, I think you both have been touching on this same theme in your pieces together.
And I also, if I could just add one thing, I don't think we can overestimate the importance of a ceasefire, even if it is just for a couple of days. To get a pause in the conflict is really important, not just to allow humanitarian aid to get in and to allow injured people to be treated and bodies to be buried, but it is a confidence building measure that exists between Israel and Hamas, and also between the people who've been working behind the scenes to get this ceasefire happening, like Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE, of course. It's almost like when you're in a war, the warring parties can't envisage a time when they won't be fighting. And when suddenly the guns fall silent, that is when the real work can start to happen.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit, though, about what is happening in the West Bank?
Well, what's happening in the West Bank is an escalation of what's been happening in the West Bank since Israel's military occupation began. But what we have is groups of extremist settlers who are supported by the Israeli military, basically rampaging through villages and towns and farming communities in the West Bank. They're stealing land. They're taking over people's houses. They're killing Palestinians. They're destroying their olive trees. They're preventing farmers from being able to harvest their crops. And they're doing this with impunity. And what happens when the rest of the Middle East looks on at the kind of violence that is allowed to happen and that is being encouraged by ministers in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's own government. It reduces the trust in Israel as a partner in the Middle East, and it increases the likelihood of other fronts opening up in this conflict.
And Marc, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that too, because one of your most recent pieces was on Israel's changing demography and what had been included in their budget that might be giving rise to, I don't know, confidence among settlers.
Yeah, I mean, it's, there is a kind of very difficult problem here, which is that you have a government that is the most religiously conservative, the most nationalist in Israeli history, which is in power now. It's a coalition. And in order to, it's a fairly unstable coalition. And in order to maintain it, Netanyahu has had to give a lot of power and money to the sort of ultra-right elements in his coalition partners, essentially. And so you see there, it would be, I think, fundamentally wrong to say, it's their fault that October 7 happened. It's not like Hamas doesn't have agency. Hamas is its own agent. It's been building for this campaign for a very long time, and it has a settled position, which is that Israel should not exist. So, that would be wrong. But what they have done, speaking of the ultra-right parties in the government and the government, under their influence, what they have done is to make this possible. What happened on October 7th, because the attention of the security services, the attention of the army, even troops were moved to the West Bank to deal with exactly the problems that Ruth was describing. And these, that was a sort of a policy in which Netanyahu basically said, okay, Hamas takes care of Gaza, we're fine so long as they stay in their walls, and they can do whatever they want. And then, we can handle the rockets that they pitch. But in the meantime, what we want to do is make sure that, we can do what we want in the West Bank, we can expand these settlements, and we don't really need any kind of strong partner in the Palestinian Authority for talks on a two-state solution, because we don't want one. We want a one-state solution on our terms. And this is how we got here, essentially. The Israelis, the Israeli public is furious with the government, blames the government for having done exactly that, having let the guard down toward Hamas by, just giving rein to the settlers. So it's, this isn't an outsider view. It's not an Arab view or a Palestinian. It's Israelis. There was a poll recently that said that 80% want Netanyahu to acknowledge responsibility for allowing it to happen in security terms.
Yeah. And can we talk about the U.S.'s relationship too with Israel? Because Ruth, in your piece, you kind of note that the U.S. is paying attention to what has been happening in the West Bank. Biden noted in an op-ed last week in the Washington Post that the U.S. is considering issuing visa bans against extremist settlers for violence against civilians. So yeah, what is interesting there? What are you paying attention to?
I think it's really interesting that Biden is finally talking about the West Bank and not just mentioning extremist settlers as an isolated incident that is concerning security authorities. But the problem is that this is a cyclical conflict, and you see this time and again where Israel goes so far to a certain point, whether it's with bombing Gaza, whether it's with allowing extremist settlers to run riot in the West Bank. And the US gives Israel enough rope, and then finally it says, no, enough. And I feel like we're getting close to that point now. I don't know if we are at that point yet, but this is the sort of cycle that you can almost, a diplomatic cycle at least, that you can almost set your watch by when it comes to the US and Israel and the rest of the Middle East.
If I could jump in, I mean, one thing that in response to the column that I wrote today, I got a few really actually very interesting responses by email. Basically saying, okay, accept the sort of general point that that Israel can win the war and win the fight and lose the war, but basically saying I don't think you fully understand what it is to be someone who lives 20 miles from Gaza, and how long we've been dealing with this, trying to find a settlement, not finding one, dealing with these attacks, and then we have what happened on October 7th, and the full scale of that. It's hard to imagine if you don't live in Israel, but that I had compared it with 9/11 and the risks of making the same mistakes that the U.S. made after 9/11, and their point was it's not like 9/11. The threat to the U.S., even though it was an attack on U.S. soil, the threat was distant. It was a few thousand people in a country of several hundred million. Here we're talking about a very significant part of the population that was either killed, injured, or displaced. A couple of 100,000 people displaced from their homes, and the risk to us is that much larger. That it's more than you would normally consider a terrorist threat, which is significant enough. So I found that quite interesting. This sense that there is unity within Israel. We're a very divided society otherwise, but there's unity in Israel on this one point that we have to take this opportunity to destroy Hamas. We just have to. And that is why I think, the point that Ruth made is absolutely right, that in the past, the US has, called time on some of these operations. There's been 4 in Gaza, in the past. But I think it might be difficult this time to call time, that the US may say it's time to stop. It's also possible that Israel will say, we're not stopping.
I mean, both of you have covered previous wars that have happened in this region in the past. Is there anything, covering it this time that makes you think things will end differently?
I'll defer to you, Marc, since you've been on the ground in Israel.
No, I think it's, I think you have to be a systemic optimist. So because the alternatives are awful. So you have to look for ways that you can, turn what is a catastrophe for both sides into an opportunity. And I think that's what we have to work towards. I think that's what everyone should be working towards. And there are some elements here that, give hope. The situation around Israel, until this began, was less hostile than it has been, in the 1970s and the 1980s, etc. You had real possibilities for, countries normalizing their relationship, and it's possible that the fact that the Saudis were close to doing so is the reason that Hamas did what they did to destroy that. But that environment is there. It's less hostile than it once was. But otherwise, I'm afraid that internally, on both sides, they're dug in harder than before, and it's really difficult now. Even on the Hamas side, it's been in charge for 16 years. Within Hamas, it was in charge of the education system. You got a population in Gaza, which is 50%, under 21 or 18, I can't remember, but it is a very young population. They're being educated by people who say, Israel has no right to exist. It needs to be destroyed, and that has an impact too. And these things, it just makes everything more intractable. It doesn't mean that there aren't better solutions. The two-state solution is still the only, humane possible solution that exists. Everything else ultimately ends with ethnic cleansing, which is just unspeakable.
And I mean, I think, Marc, you talked about how Israelis were feeling about and how vulnerable they were feeling after the Hamas attack. And certainly in those communities along the Hamas wall, many of whom were deeply invested in the two-state solution and the peace process. You had Vivian Silva, for example, a fabulous woman who ran a couple of different NGOs, and was deeply involved in helping to transport sick Gazans from Eretz Crossing to hospitals in Israel. So when people like that are getting killed around you, it is obviously an incredibly disturbing and upsetting thing. Of course, about percentages of people who were hurt and injured that Hamas, I mean, we've got at least 13,000 people dead in Gaza, 1.7 million Gazans displaced, at least 5,000 children dead. So talking about the percentage of a population, you're talking about, an incredibly significant percentage of the population who have endured this war. And some of them, as 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds, this is the fourth full-on war that they have lived through, and the intergenerational trauma that creates really can't be underestimated. And I don't necessarily think breeds militancy in every case, but what it does do is make the coming together of the two populations so much more difficult. I mean, if you look at how excited the world was when Xi and Biden met this week, right? Because we can't underestimate the importance of face-to-face contact and human relations as a way of diffusing conflict and understanding each other better. Now, Israel and Palestine haven't had that since the separation barrier went up in Israel more than a decade ago. And so you don't even have often the simplest person-to-person contacts that make something like a peace process a viable option. And I think until that changes, this is just going to be another really awful merry-go-round of violence.
Sadly, I agree. And this is the tragedy of the response, which has been so heavy-handed on the Israeli side. All urban warfare. I mean, one thing that I think many people don't understand is that all urban warfare is heavy-handed because it's basically impossible to do otherwise. But there was an opportunity at the beginning of all this to say, precisely because urban warfare is so deadly, we're going to take our time. We're going to give time to get people into camps that are properly supplied and remove civilians. We're going to do that before we start bombing. And I think these are mistakes that were made early on and are very, very hard to undo. And yes, the death toll has been horrendous.
Yeah. But I guess back to what Ruth was saying, where do you see then the role of intermediaries, like trying to step in and form that bridge with these two sides not speaking? So Qatar mediating this potential truce deal, the US's role, other Arab nations. Like, what do you see as necessary from onlookers to try and mediate things?
I think one of the reasons that we ended up in this situation right now is that everyone had sort of declared the two-state solution dead and walked away, right? You had the Arab Spring, you had ISIS, you had a whole bunch of other really important geopolitical currents running through the Middle East, and everyone who had been heavily involved in it suddenly just wasn't anymore. And that suited Israel very well because Israel just wanted to get on with expanding its settlements, which are considered illegal under international law, and continue to take as much land as they could to make sure that the two-state solution wasn't possible. The Palestinian Authority, is an absolutely spent force in its current form. The president, Mahmoud Abbas, was elected in 2005 for a 4-year term, and he's still in office today. Palestinians in the West Bank are absolutely despairing about the fact that they have this impotent body representing them to the rest of the world. And I think, if anything can come out of this, it's that we are now refocusing on what has been one of the longest running conflicts and the longest running military occupations in the world. And if this can help us get to the next point in working out how do we work out a two-state solution? How do we find a safe place for Palestinians and a state where Israel feels safe as well? I mean, they are the big questions, and we need Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Jordan and Egypt as the bordering countries, as well as Turkey, probably, to really focus on this, and to devote their significant political capital to making it happen.
Yeah. So both of you have written in your many pieces that the longer this war drags on, the greater the risks for Israel, for everyone. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of expound on that, Marc and Ruth.
Well, I think that's true in the round. That you see this death toll mounting all the time. The images are just horrific, and of the suffering that's going on in Gaza. Unfortunately, that has kind of overwritten the suffering that happened on October the 7th to Israelis for much of the world. This is something that is very upsets Israelis, and I understand why. But I think it's something that certainly their government needs to just take on board. So the longer that this goes on at this kind of rate, it's not so much the time, it's what's happening in that time. So if you were to use that time and say, okay, we're going to have a ceasefire and it's for 3-5 days, and then you were going to say, well, we're actually getting some stuff done. We're going to try and get some more hostages dealt with. We're going to get some more aid in. We're going to, try and get more injured people out. We'll do that. That time would be well spent and wouldn't necessarily, make it more difficult. It might make it better. This is my point about, using the truce. The Israelis are very unhappy about the idea of a ceasefire because that's to suggest something permanent. But they are, by dint of having hundreds of thousands of troops at their disposal, they're in charge, and they can determine the schedule.
And it's always really difficult, I think, to contemplate a ceasefire if you're already inside a territory and you have, as you say, like thousands and thousands of troops committed. But at the same time, the importance of that kind of pause just cannot be overstated. And I really do think that the US could be working a lot harder than it is to make that happen. I think a lot, across the Arab world, people are can very much see a double standard in the US sending billions of dollars of weapons to Israel and then wondering why it won't enact a ceasefire. And so for the US to regain some kind of credibility in the Middle East peace process, then it's going to have to somehow reconcile that double standard.
Yeah. And just also, what would a possible truce deal do in terms of public opinion on the war in the West? I think there was a piece in the FT earlier today about just how much public opinion has shifted. And Marc, I know you've written about this as well. It would be a chance to sort of retake the, image narrative. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's the only way. Opinions are so set that it would be foolish, I think, to say, well, if Israel agrees to a humanitarian pause for 5 days, that will, change the way that people feel who've been protesting and so on. It won't. That anger will remain, and they are committed. But I do think that, Israel has to start thinking, or the government needs to start thinking, how do we get out of this? We do not want, they really don't need, it's not good for Israel to be, just have a vista that says, okay, we're going to occupy this place until it doesn't need occupying, because that is forever. So they need to try and find, a path that would allow that kind of mediation we've been talking about to actually have something to grasp onto. And I think, in fairness to the US, I think they've actually, much of what they've been saying and trying to do at a diplomatic level has been exactly right. The problem is, as Ruth was saying, that the Israelis know full well that politically, the Biden administration is captured. It's very, very difficult for them to say, okay, we're not gonna support Israel. I mean, that's just very unlikely to happen, and the Israelis know it. So it's a tough one. But the only way that you can start to make it happen is by having some kind of truce and see where you can get.
Yep. All right. And to wrap up, can both of you just say, what you're closely watching next? What are you thinking about? What will your next column probably be?
I'm looking at East Jerusalem quite closely because I can see there's already an uptick in extremist settlers moving into even more properties in East Jerusalem, which is an incredibly crowded and highly contested area. And I think after the West Bank, it can be one of the next flashpoints. So that's what I'm watching.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at desperately looking for reasons to hope or to kind of create that path. And what I wanted to do was to kind of look back at previous times, going back into the 90s and going forward, and look at what actually happened in Gaza when there were moments of opportunity, how close it actually came to cohabitation at certain points.